Hi, this is Marvin, cycling coach at Alpine Cols. If you're planning to ride the Etape du Tour, you're in the right place. I'm about to give you a ton of tips based on years of experience at events like the Etape. If you put these into practice on July 20, you'll definitely improve your performance. So let's get started. By far the most important things to get right are your pacing, especially on the climbs, and your fueling. Both of these require a proper race plan and then the ability to stick to it. So Benjamin Franklin wasn't a cyclist, of course, but his quote is still highly relevant. If you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. You need a plan for how you're going to taper so that you're in the best possible condition for the event, a plan for your travel and final preparations so that all goes smoothly without stress, and then a plan for the race itself. So let's talk about these first before we come to the actual race plan. As I speak, there are less than 2 weeks to go before the Etape. Some people should have done their last long, hard rides last weekend. Others can carry on training hard for a few more days. Tapering is highly individual, and what works for one person may not work for another. Your taper should be longer if you are older, less fit, less strong, or if you recover slowly. And it can be shorter if you're younger, very fit, very strong, and if you recover quickly. If in doubt, though, better to back off sooner. Remember, the goal of the taper is to eliminate fatigue without losing fitness. So training hard right up to the event is very risky for little payoff. So if in doubt, it's better to back off. My general suggestion is to reduce training volume by at least 50% in the final few days, and especially to limit the intensity. But again, this is highly individual, and particularly for very strong riders, an aggressive taper can be beneficial. I've personally learned that it doesn't work for me, and I'm better off being fully rested, but then I'm older than most of you. Next part of your planning concerns your travel and final preparations leading up to the start. This is mostly common sense, but it's much better to think it through and plan it out in advance so you don't get caught up in a last-minute panic. So plan your travel carefully, confirm your accommodation, book your evening meal in advance because the restaurants get very full, or perhaps even prepare your own food, take it with you. And when you're ready to start packing, make sure you pack your bike at least one day in advance, and then it's a good idea to use a checklist for your kit so you don't forget anything. If you'd like a copy of our checklist, you'll find a link in the comments. Now let's come to the event itself. You need to break it down into sections and then plan your pace, your nutrition, hydration, tactics, and so on, section by section. For me, on this year's Etape du Tour, there are 9 distinct sections, but you could further break down sections 3 and 6 if you thought it worthwhile. Now let's look first at how to plan your pace. To do this, I'm going to use an example of my own ride at the Etape in 2018. The main difference between this year's profile and 2018's is the flat sections are much shorter this year. I'm going to focus on the climbs because this is where the pacing is most important. The first thing to know about pacing is that a negative split nearly always gives better results than a positive split, meaning you should start slightly slower and finish slightly faster. Be aware that nearly everybody does the opposite because they get sucked into a drag race in the first few kilometers, but this is not a good idea. My plan for the climbs in 2018 was therefore to do them all at the same steady 235 watts from start to finish, with the exception of one of them, we'll see in a minute, and try to push a bit harder on the final climb. So let's take a look at where the 235 watt target came from. The pace you plan to race at must be derived from evidence and not from hope. Importantly, on the day itself, it will be super tempting to ride too fast because of the excitement and the adrenaline and the other riders overtaking you. The fact is, miracles don't happen very often, and it's unlikely you're going to be a lot stronger at the Etape than you were in training or at other events. So let's look at how I use the evidence to come up with that 235 watt target. The best evidence comes from your own power meter. Assuming it's always calibrated and the data is accurate, it tells you what you need to know. So I started by listing the recent events I'd ridden, which were Liège-Bastogne-Liège, the Le Trois Cols, the Time Megève, and the Granfondo. These are all sportives in the mountains, So they give useful data on the average power it achieved on the climbs during these events, which are comparable to the Etape. The time measure and the Granfondo that I rode that year was sub-maximum efforts because I was accompanying and coaching clients at those events. So I know I could do a bit better than the 210, 220 watts that's showing there. I didn't think I could match the 242 watts from the Trois Cols, however, because it was significantly shorter than the Etape. Therefore, I was able to ride a bit harder. So based on this, I decided to target the Etape at 235 watts, which was 85% of my FTP at the time. And this, of course, is on the climbs, with the exception of the Glière, which is very steep, so you need a bit more power. Now, it's really important you do this analysis for yourself, and obviously don't use my numbers, which could easily be either much too high or much too low for you. So note that even the percent of FTP is not easily transferable from one rider to another, because the higher your FTP per kilogram, the less time you'll take on each climb, and therefore the higher your target percentage of FTP can be. For reference, my FTP in watts per kilo at the time was 3.9. So let's see what happened. On this chart, you can see my power recording for the whole event. The sections marked 1, 2, 3, and 4 are the main climbs. Note my very steady power output from start to finish across each of these climbs. So number 1 there, number 2, and then 3 and 4. This is what you should be aiming at. You want the climb to be at as steady a pace as possible. So on the first climb, the Col de la Coiffrie, I rode at 238 watts, or just 3 watts above my target. And I was the 2,576th fastest rider on this climb. On the second climb to the Glière, I rode at 254 watts. This is a much steeper climb, so it's normal the power is a bit higher. You can see my pacing strategy was starting to pay off because I'd already gained over 800 places. There I was 1,728th. On the third major climb to the Col de Rome, I was again able to hold 235 watts. The plan fed us slightly above again. And now I was the 673rd fastest rider on this climb. And finally, on the final climb, the last climb to the Colombière, I couldn't quite hold my target of 235, but I still improved my relative ranking, was in the top 500 on this climb. I think the reason for being unable to hold 235 watts was more down to fueling than pacing, in fact. The descent between the Rome and the Colombière is quite steep and dangerous, and I didn't manage to refuel as much as I should have done. So there, what you can see is by a very steady and well thought out pacing plan, I was able to significantly, really significantly improve my placing climb after climb after climb. So for me, that was a very successful pacing strategy, and I highly recommend you try and do something similar. So that's all well and good, you might say, but what if you don't have a power meter? In this case, all is not lost. You can use VAM, which is your vertical speed in elevation meters per hour, which in the absence of wind and at speeds below about 15 kilometers per hour, VAM is extremely closely correlated to power. You can find this data on Strava after your ride, as you can see on the chart there, or you can see it in real time if you add VAM and especially lap VAM to your bike computer. So trip the lap at the beginning of the climb, and that will then give you your VAM as you go up. You want to look for the longest possible climbs and see what you did on Strava. So in the example here, I did the Telegraph in 57 minutes and 23 seconds at 212 watts and a VAM of 883. Note that the VAM which is given on the Galibier is not meaningful because it includes the descent it includes in fact the climb of the Telegraph as well, and then the descent between the Telegraph and Valois. So make sure you're looking at a continual climb to get the VAM you're able to manage. You can, of course, also use heart rate as an indicator. Heart rate measures your internal load, but it's a bit less reliable than power or VAM because it's influenced by many other factors such as the stress, the temperature, any caffeine you may have taken, your state of dehydration, and so on. And finally, some people are sufficiently in tune with their feelings to get a good result just by feeling the effort. But to be fair, to get this right takes a huge amount of experience. Now, what if it's very hot? This was the case during our Etape training camp in June, when it was well over 30 degrees. You can see one of our participants here climbing above the lake on the Cormet de Roselin, and then at the arrival in Le Plain, where he was absolutely knocked out. The thing is, the hotter it is, the less power you can produce at a given intensity. A 2021 study showed that the reduction in power at 35 degrees centigrade can be as high as 17%. Therefore, when it's very hot, don't look at power, look at your heart rate. Stick to your heart rate target for the desired intensity and accept that your power may be 10 or 15% lower than you hoped. Okay, to continue on the theme of high temperatures, there are two challenges when cycling for many hours in very hot weather. The first is to avoid dehydration, and the second is to avoid overheating. So in terms of dehydration, you want to drink a neutral electrolyte mix, enough so that you need to urinate occasionally, several times during the attack. You'll probably be on the bike for between 7 and 10 or even 11 hours. So if you're not urinating at all in that time, that is definitely a problem. You should never feel thirsty, and your heart rate should never become abnormally high. Okay, so those are three things to look for. Now, to avoid overheating, the techniques for that are, one is to keep the intensity down, don't push too hard, to stay as much as possible in the shade. The good thing about the Etape, of course, is the roads are closed, so you can choose the left or the right-hand side of the road, wherever the shade is. Stop to cool down. If you're feeling really overheating, then you must stop, in fact, just for safety. Keep spraying yourself with water, especially your head and your legs. And don't hesitate, to stop and use water fountains. There are plenty of water fountains by the side of the road in France, or streams to cool off in. So it's likely to be very hot, so remember those tips and look after yourself. There's no point in you don't want to wind up in hospital through heat stroke. Here's an example from our camp. So don't even get in I've seen riders literally get into water fountains, and why not? It's a great way to cool down. Now, so that's for pace and how dealing with the heat. Now let's look at the second critical thing to get right, which is your nutrition and your hydration. So first, some basic guidelines on the hydration side. One, it's essential to carry 2 water bottles, preferably large ones, at least 75 milliliters, and drink from one or the other on a frequent basis. Always, just a safety note, always look up the road ahead while you're drinking and be ready to chuck the bottle in an emergency. Now, as a rule of thumb, you should be drinking 500 milliliters an hour, which is 1 small bottle or 2/3 of a larger bottle, and perhaps a bit less if it's cold, which is very unlikely at the Etape, but definitely more if it's very hot. You might need to put down at least a bottle an hour if it's very hot, so 750 milliliters. Now for the nutrition side. It doesn't really matter what you eat, so long as it's mostly carbohydrate and you can get it out easily and eat it while riding, and you can keep it down. Good choices include bananas, dried fruit such as figs, apricots, dates, that sort of stuff, biscuits, buns, new potatoes, flapjacks, and of course commercial energy bars and gels. But whatever works for you, that's really not the issue. The issue is the quantity. So current recommendations are to consume a minimum of 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour and as much as 100, even 120. But the actual amount of carbs you can consume or you will be able to consume during the event depends on what you are used to doing in training. Don't attempt to increase it dramatically on the day because it just won't work. But do see 60 grams per hour as the minimum. Okay, that's really important. You're just not going to reach the end. You're going to run out of energy before the end if you cannot get down 60 grams an hour. 60 grams corresponds to between 2 and 4 items per hour, where an item is, for example, a gel, an energy bar, or a bottle of energy mix. The important thing is to keep eating little and often and to never drop behind. You never miss half an hour of eating and drinking because you cannot catch up. Here are a few more tips for fueling. The first is to carry as much as possible with you from the start for two reasons. One, you know what you've got and you won't be surprised by something which doesn't agree with you. And two, you can save an awful lot of time by only needing to pick up water at the feed stations. There are two places you can carry your food, either in your jersey pockets or in a special bag mounted on your top tube just behind the stem, or even on a saddlebag if you want. It's very important, or a handle, a bag over the handlebars. It's very important from a safety standpoint that you keep looking at the road ahead while you're getting the food out and also while eating it. If there's any risk, throw it away and grab the bars with both hands. Okay. Next tip is to test everything in advance. If you haven't tested something in training, don't test it at the Etape. You could have a nasty surprise. Third tip is to avoid any bars which are dry and crumbly because they stick in your throat and they might go down the wrong way. And then finally, pre-open the wrappers to make it easy to access. Okay, so that's a few tips on fueling. Now I'm going to conclude with a few go faster tips and then a few mistakes to avoid, and then we'll look at the plan. So the first and most obvious go faster tip is to have your bike in perfect condition. It would be too stupid to have an avoidable puncture or mechanical, or to have something that's rubbing, or to have forgotten to oil your chain or something. So make sure your bike's in great condition. The second is to be as efficient as possible while you're climbing. The tip here is to keep your upper body still and relaxed and focus all your energy into your legs. Drive from the hips down. You should drop your heels and lock your ankles when it's steep and stand up on the pedals regularly at a low cadence to use your muscles differently. So every so often stand up, drop the gears, make the gears harder to drop the cadence, and that will help as well. The purpose of dropping the cadence is to avoid peaking your heart rate, and you get the rest without spiking your heart, which is great. The third tip is, it's amazing how many people don't do this. Don't forget to pedal downhill whenever it's safe to do so. For very little energy, you get a little bit of extra speed that's almost free, and you keep your blood flowing to avoid stiffening up in your legs and perhaps causing cramps on the next climb. So pedal downhill. Fourth tip, if your goal is to finish quickly, or if the broom wagon is catching you, minimize the time you spend actually stopped. Obviously, whenever you're stopped, you're not making progress. The feed stations can be very busy and you can easily lose a lot of time, which is why it's a great idea to have as much food with you as possible. But also think about stopping at public water stations instead. So here's an example. This one is in Ardèche, sorry. It's about 1/3 of the way up the Col du Pré, so just after Beaufort. Finally, mental skills. Use your head. There will almost certainly be times on the Etape du Tour when you wonder why you're doing this, and you have to fight an overwhelming desire to stop. This is not just a physical challenge, it's really a mental challenge as well. So for some people, this sort of sudden desire to stop and give up is going to happen on the steep section of the Col du Pré. That's a really tough climb. For many others, it will happen on the final climb to La Plagne, which again is long, it's relentlessly steep, and it's mostly in the full sun, so it'll be really tough. There are three main mental approaches that will help you to keep turning the pedals, all of which you should try and practice if you haven't done so already, in the training you've got left. So the first is to have a clear reason why you're doing it, because if you can't come up with a clear reason why it's important to finish, then why bother? The second is to find ways to reduce your perception of effort, how hard it feels. So anything you can do to make it feel a bit less hard, and most of it's to do with distraction, so thinking about other things will help you continue. And the third thing you can do is use positive self-talk to encourage yourself and to keep yourself going. So Work out those things for yourself, have them in mind, and then you can use them when the going gets tough. Now, 3 mistakes to avoid. The first is going too fast at the start and on the first climb. If you use too much energy here, it will really cost you very, very dearly later on in the event. Second is a little bit similar point. It's to burn too many matches. What I mean by that is by going into high intensity, even for a short time. It's called burning a match. Trying to stay with people who are stronger than you. So if someone is stronger than you, let him go. There's no point in trying to stay with him. And the third is forgetting to eat and drink. Okay, so you must eat and drink something at least every 15 minutes throughout the whole ride. Now we can pull all of this together in a race plan. This is the first part of an example plan for a total ride time of 9 hours, including brief stops to pick up extra water or food if necessary. Now, don't just copy this plan, but think it through carefully for yourself and adapt it to your own level and your experience. The first section is the start, which is the 9 kilometers from the start line itself to the beginning of the first climb in Ugine. This will take most people about 20 minutes, give or take. So a good tactic here is to pick a good wheel to follow if you're comfortable riding in just behind someone, and to make sure the pace is sustainable above all, without burning matches. We just talked about that. In terms of nutrition, you might take a small gel, a typical 30-gram gel, perhaps just 2 minutes before the start, and then drink a quarter of a bottle of energy drink during those 20 minutes. Next is the climb up the Côte d'Héry, the first climb. As we saw earlier, it's really important not to start up this too hard, and you must get your nutrition and hydration right so you don't start falling behind. There's then a short descent, which is twisty and quite dangerous, so be very careful. I can practically guarantee there'll be accidents here on the day. You then cross a bridge and start up a long climb to the Col des Saisies. It's really important to ride this at your own pace, and again, to keep eating and drinking. Once over the top, there's a long descent. Again, take this at a controlled speed and slow down for the corners. No silly risks. Take advantage of the flatter sections to eat and drink. So you can see that's just a continual theme. So here's the rest of the plan, which I'm not going to comment in detail, because in any case, again, you need to adapt it for yourself. Remember that failing to plan is planning to fail. So stick to the plan. Planning is not enough. You also need to stick to it. So how are you going to do that? The question is, how on earth am I going to remember all of that? Well, of course, you can try and learn it, but we can also take a tip from the pros. This is Mathieu van der Poel's nutrition sticker from the Tour de Flanders of a couple of years ago. The plan was for him to consume upwards of 100 grams of carbohydrate per hour. So on that sticker, you can see the kilometers, and you can see those codes for the food, where the circles are rice cakes, the rectangles are energy bars, the ones shaped like a gel are gels, of course, and the bottles are bottles of energy drink. So you can copy this idea and then create something similar for yourself, and that will help you remember your plan. So that's it. I hope you found it useful. Check out alpinecols.com, www.alpinecols.com in one word, if you plan to ride the Etape in 2026 and would like professional coaching or a training camp on the actual route of the Etape. We'll be running a training camp as we do every year, most likely in June of 2026. In the meantime, this is Marvin wishing you very good luck and a great ride on July the 20th. Take care, and above all, stay safe.